So thanks for having me. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a very recent, very exploratory project about virtual social interaction, loneliness, and well-being among emerging adults during the COVID pandemic. And this is a study that I and colleagues ran last year when I was still at UCLA, and then it kind of continued a little bit into this year. So modern technology has drastically changed the way we socialize and communicate. We can maintain these large social networks that are unlimited by geographic boundaries in real time with instant communication and with things like enriched video capabilities. But as more of our lives are moving online, we sought to investigate this question. Do virtual social interactions satisfy our need for social connection? And further, can virtual social interaction help combat loneliness when physical proximity is impossible or ill-advised, as is now with the COVID pandemic? So you may have seen, and public opinion has largely advanced the negative consequences of online social networking. With headlines like this, even very recently, we've seen headlines like this from the BBC and other places, but the empirical evidence is quite mixed. So one study found, and this was an experimental study, found no effect of social media abstinence on self-reported loneliness or well-being. And a recent large observational study did find a negative relationship between digital engagement and well-being, but the effect was very small as to be basically clinically meaningless. So while we don't really know how virtual social interaction might influence mental health, we do know quite a bit about isolation. So isolation and stress pose many socio-emotional health risks, including loneliness. And loneliness is associated with decrements in mental health, including the onset of depression. And in fact, some studies report that lonely individuals are 5 to 40 times more likely to score above clinical cutoffs for depression. And amid the lockdown, 44% of young adults in the UK reported feeling lonely, as opposed to only about 16% before lockdown, and similar results have been found in the US and other countries. And then moreover, younger adults aged 18 to 25 are already at increased risk for psychiatric disorders relative to other age groups. And because of this potential vulnerability, it's important to investigate how isolation and social distancing might be differentially affecting them. So recent research has redefined the period between the late teens and the early 20s. It used to be thought of as adulthood, but we've kind of rethought it as this unique developmental stage known as emerging adulthood and even sometimes late adolescence. And importantly, it's characterized by continued refinements in brain structure and function. So the brain continues to develop basically until the age of 25. And it's also a time of changing social and developmental goals. So the increased importance of peer relationships, attaining higher education, starting a career. And interestingly, studies have reported that this age group spends more of their time alone than any other, excluding the elderly. So we propose that social distancing might pose kind of unique challenges to this vulnerable group by further isolating them, as well as kind of working in direct contrast to their developmental goals. So broadly, we were interested in whether virtual social interactions can satisfy our need for social connection. And further, can digital technologies help bridge social distance while physical distancing measures are in place? And then specifically, might virtual social interactions help buffer against loneliness and support mental health in emerging adults during COVID? So to answer this question, we used a mixed method quantitative and qualitative approach using an online survey. And the survey contained several questionnaires about stress, mental health, somatic symptoms, social support, and well-being. So I'll just be presenting a subset of that data today. We collected data from 119 participants, mostly UCLA undergraduate students, with an average age of approximately 20, and the age range was 18 to 25 and 95 females. And then just for some context, not that any of us need it. But on March 10th last year at UCLA, classes were canceled and students were sent home. And then we collected data from April to June of 2020. So quite recently after the onset of the pandemic and the lockdowns. And we were interested in how much people were interacting both virtually and in person. So we had several outcome variables of well-being, in addition to these measures of virtual social interaction, including social isolation, loneliness, depression, happiness, and friendship quality. So to measure virtual social interaction, we used the Adolescent Social Connection and Coping During COVID questionnaire, which assessed 4 main components. So participants reported the frequency of their virtual social interactions within the last 2 weeks on a 7-point scale from never to almost constantly. They also reported how socially connected their virtual social interactions made them feel on a scale from very socially disconnected to very socially connected. They also indicated the number of different platforms they were using to engage in social interactions. So when I say platforms, I mean like messaging, voice calls, video calls, so almost the medium that they're using. And then finally, they indicated which of these was their primary platform. And then in addition to having them report on these components in the last 2 weeks, we had them report retrospectively their usage in a typical 2-week period before the onset of COVID. To measure isolation, we had participants report their household size for a more objective measure of isolation. For loneliness, we used the UCLA Loneliness Scale. For depression, the Beck Depression Inventory, and for happiness, the Subjective Happiness Scale. And then we also had participants report on these variables within the last 2 weeks, so during the COVID pandemic, and then retrospectively before COVID-19 for household size and depression as well. And then we kind of wanted to look a little more qualitatively at friendships. So we had participants report on how well their friends were meeting their social needs, both before COVID and during COVID. We had them rate how the quality of their friendships had changed on a scale from much more negative to much more positive. And then finally, we had participants list and write whether there were any important aspects of their friendships that they were no longer engaging in and did not have a good substitute for amid COVID. So now I'll show you some of the descriptive results. So if we want to understand whether these virtual social interactions might be a little bit protective amid COVID, we first wanted to know whether and how people's well-being and social interactions changed based on their own reports. So here I'll show you several variables and how those differed between these current and retrospective reports. So first, let's look at depression. And the purple distribution is showing people's retrospective responses before COVID, and yellow is their current responses. And we found large increase in reported depressive symptoms. We also found a decrease in reports of social needs being met. We found an increase in household size, as many of our participants had returned home to live with their families amid the outbreak. And we found similar levels of virtual social interaction frequency and number of platforms used. However, we found a decrease in reported feelings of connection derived from these virtual social interactions pre to post pandemic onset. So on the whole, it seems like well-being is kind of suffering amid lockdown in these emerging adults. So now we'll see how these virtual social interactions influenced our well-being variables of interest. So using multiple linear regression, we looked at how objective isolation and virtual social interactions were associated with participants' ratings of loneliness during COVID. And there was a significant effect of household size. So participants with a higher number of household members reported lower levels of loneliness. And here you can see that in this partial regression plot. However, none of the other effects of virtual social interaction variables were significant predictors of loneliness in the sample, neither was age or sex. So then we also looked at this with depression. And we again found a significant negative association between household size and depression. So participants with a higher number of household members reported lower levels of depression. And we also found a positive relationship between the number of platforms used and depression, whereby participants who reported using a greater number of platforms also reported higher levels of depression, and none of the other variables were significant. And then finally, for happiness, again, we found this positive association between household size and well-being, whereby participants with a greater number of household members reported higher levels of happiness. And we also found a positive relationship between feelings of connection derived from social interactions and happiness. So participants who reported that they were feeling more connected during these interactions reported higher levels of happiness. So now, before I move on to the discussion and some of the limitations, I wanted to show you a little bit of our qualitative data. So again, here participants were asked to write about aspects of their friendships that had changed during COVID and could not be replaced by virtual methods. And these were not mutually exclusive, so they could indicate as many as they wanted. And 28 out of 119 participants provided a response to this prompt. So roughly a quarter of participants indicated that there was something they felt they couldn't replace. And these free responses were coded based on similarity of content in these 11 categories. And interestingly, the most common category was one that we just called togetherness, which was this really diffuse category that consisted of things like hanging out and just being together. So almost like physical proximity without any kind of purpose. And importantly, participants reported that their friends met their social needs very well before COVID-19 and moderately amid COVID-19, and this decrease was large and significant. 22 participants reported that their friendships improved, 55 reported no change, and 40 reported that their friendships worsened, though the average reported decrease was not statistically significant. So in summary, we found converging evidence to suggest that there is a bit of reduced well-being and changes in social support among emerging adults amid COVID-19. We found a large increase in reported depressive symptoms, a large decrease in reported social needs being met, and a decrease in feelings of connection derived from these virtual social interactions during this period. So in terms of our hypotheses, we found quite strong evidence that objective social isolation was negatively associated with loneliness and other measures of well-being as indexed by household size. But we found no evidence that for the protective influence of virtual social interactions, and really minimal evidence for any harmful influence of virtual social interaction on well-being. So one thing to consider is that it's possible that these associations are really complex and potentially too complex to be observed in the kinds of analyses that we employed here. So ideally, we would prospectively track loneliness, mental health, and virtual social interactions in a longitudinal design. So for example, someone might have many interactions that aren't meaningful or few interactions that are meaningful. And so maybe this kind of simplified approach doesn't really capture that. It's also important to think about bi-directional relationships between these two things. So for example, people who are happier already may kind of derive more feelings of connection from these virtual interactions, and also might use these virtual platforms in ways that promote and facilitate social connection. Which brings me to my second point, is that I think in future research, it's also really critical for us to think about the quality of these virtual social interactions. And past research does support that there are a variety of ways of using these interactions, including kind of connection promoting and non-connection promoting ways. So for example, Zooming with a friend would be connection promoting versus passively scrolling through an Instagram page. We also did find a really robust influence of household size on well-being, and this kind of led us to wonder about familial support in emerging adulthood, as 68% of our sample did not ordinarily live with family, but returned home to live with family amid the outbreak. And contrary to popular belief, recent evidence has suggested that parents still do play a significant role in the lives of these emerging adults, specifically embodying a kind of stability which may be really crucial during times of volatility. So in conclusion, while there's been much research in recent years on virtual communication technologies and mental health, young people also typically experience a really rich and varied in-person social life. So we were really interested in exploring these relationships when the pandemic had allowed us to explore a very reduced in-person contact. And I think in future research, it's critical to determine ways to facilitate these meaningful interactions and promote connection and fill these identified gaps to combat the negative outcomes of this pandemic and also future crises where this kind of physical distancing might also be important. And that's all I have.